Hallelujah, 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 The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus proposed a parable to the crowds. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a person took and sowed in a field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, yet when full grown, it is the largest of plants. It becomes a large bush, and the birds of the sky come and dwell in its branches. He spoke to them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of wheat flour until the whole batch was leavened. All these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables. He spoke to them only in parables to fulfill what had been said through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will announce what has lain hidden from the foundation of the world. The Gospel of the Lord. In today's first reading, we hear about the story of the golden calf. And it's one of those scenarios where, again, we might be puzzled why people would be tempted to worship a golden calf. We now know from people who have studied ancient Egypt, we know that one of the gods of Egypt was a god named Apis, who was worshipped in the form of calf. And he was also the fertility god, which in the ancient world oftentimes rites of fertility would include ritual prostitution and things like that. So it wasn't so much just that the people were tempted to worship the calf as much as they were wanting to give into their lustful desires. And so that's why they were worshiping this golden calf. And this story had immense significance on salvation history, and it's kind of a linchpin that helps resolve one of the questions that has popped up in Christianity ever since the beginning. At the very beginning of Christianity, one of the most confusing questions that Christians had to wrestle with was the connection between the Old Testament and the New, the Old Covenant and the New. It started, for example, in Acts 15, the very first ecumenical council. And there was the question about whether Gentiles needed to be circumcised before they could be baptized. That was the question, what parts of the Old Covenant are still relevant today? These questions have returned again ever since the time of the Protestant Reformation, because this is something that has come up over and over again in debates between Catholics and Protestants, but not only that, but also within Protestant denominations themselves. This is a central question. And one of the ways the difficulty gets resolved is that you have to see all of salvation history as a series of covenants that God made with his people. And a covenant is not just a contract of sorts that God made, it's basically the definition of a relationship. When we talk about the sacrament of marriage as a covenant, it's not so much a contract as much as it's a defining of the relationship. That from this point forward, the husband and wife are binding themselves to one another and to God. It's a defining of the relationship. Before the marriage, they were 2 separate people in a conditional relationship. But after the day of marriage, the relationship becomes unconditional and binding for the rest of the life. So that's what a covenant is. So God, in salvation history, he made a series of covenants with his people, defining their relationship. Starting with Adam and Eve. basically making a covenant with them over all of creation. And then because Adam and Eve sinned, God had to make a new covenant. And so he made a covenant with Noah, basically instilling him with the responsibilities that should have been Adam and Eve's. Restart of humanity. And then God made a covenant with Abraham and his descendants, and then he made a covenant with Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai. And the relationship with which he defined himself to them is that Israel was going to be like his bride, a holy nation, a people set apart, a kingdom of priests. Not meaning literally that everybody was going to be ministerial priests, but that everybody was going to be holy and had a priestly vocation to sanctify the world. This is the covenant that God made with the people of Israel. And unfortunately, right after he did this, 12 chapters later, in the reading we heard from today, the people broke that covenant. And so the relationship had to be redefined again. Israel had become like an unfaithful spouse, and so they were put under a sort of probationary period. And so many of the laws from the Old Testament, the laws that many Jews still practice today, like kosher laws and things like that, they all come from this probationary period. They come from the book of Leviticus, the book of Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy literally means the second law. That God had to make these extra laws to the people as a sort of probationary period. People who have broken a relationship, all of a sudden there's more requirements, there's stricter requirements upon them. And that's what happened with the people of Israel. So the key to understanding how the Old Covenant and the New Covenant fit together, the Old Testament and the New Testament, is recognizing which laws of the Old Testament were a part of that probationary period, whereas which parts of the law were meant to endure forever. Circumcision is one of those laws that was never meant to be binding forever. The kosher laws were laws that were never meant to be binding forever. They were part of this probationary period. And so when Jesus brings the new covenant, he's not abolishing everything that came before. He's fulfilling it, but that doesn't mean that everything from the old comes into the new. Only the things that were a lead up to the new covenant remain. And so we can see that in this story of the golden calf, and it begins to shed light on the relationship between the old and new covenant. You and I, as members of the New Covenant Church, it is as if we are living out what the Israelites were originally supposed to be living out with God, that they forfeited by their sin. By Jesus' death on the cross, he has taken Israel's place, thereby opening back up the relationship that was intended from the beginning. And we, as the new Israel and the church, we are the bride of God once again. That's why St. Paul calls the church the bride of Christ.